All right. So this room's kind of toasty, right? I don't know if any of you listen to like the Huberman Lab podcast, but about an hour of hot exposure a week is good for you. So just stick in there. So yeah, today I want to talk to you about this idea of hybrid chain and hybrid contracts. So first, a little bit about myself. So I'm Hernando. I'm a core developer at Parity. I started working at Parity back in 2019, actually, initially on the Ethereum client. Since then, I've kind of moved my way around a couple different teams, and for the last couple of years, I've been focused on smart contracts. And in particular, I've been focused on Ink. And Ink is a kind of like a framework, a set of tools, a set of libraries for you to build smart contracts in Rust. And it kind of targets the Polkadot and Substrate ecosystem. I'm not going to go too deeply into Rust today, or sorry, into Ink today. There's a lot of content out there online. But the main takeaway is that it's a simple, easy way for you to get started writing smart contracts in Rust. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the world of blockchains today. Today, it's pretty uncontroversial to have this idea of an application-specific blockchain. So a blockchain that's focused on one use case and one use case only. In the Polkadot ecosystem, this kind of manifests itself through the idea of parachains. In Cosmos, this would be the idea of zones. And these app chains have been touted as like the next evolution from smart contracts, right? We look back at Ethereum and say, oh, those were the old days, but this is how we do it now. And how did we get here? Well, for one, these app chains have a lot of benefits. They can be, since you know exactly what you're optimizing for, you can tune for your exact use case and squeeze every ounce of performance out of them. Since you own your own blockchain, you don't need to compete with anybody else for block space. On a smart contract platform, you're competing with block space with every other application on there. But on your own blockchain, you're the only user. You can use all the resources you need. App chains are also sovereign. So similarly, if you're a smart contract on some sort of host platform, if the underlying platform changes its economics, its governance, or does anything funky, you're kind of stuck with that and you're going along for the ride. Whereas if you're your own blockchain, you're the master of your own destiny in that sense. And then with app chains, you've also got this idea of synchronous composability. So you've specialized on one aspect of what you want to do, but you can still go and reach out to other blockchains, either via bridges or XCM in the world of Polkadot, and kind of access functionality that you wouldn't have otherwise. So it lets you kind of build these interesting composable applications. So we can think of having your own blockchain sort of like having a nice house in the countryside. So you've got a nice big lawn, you've got a bunch of room, you've got a ton of places where you can put all your stuff and do activities, and all your neighbors are far away. So if you want to throw a party and make noise at 3 a.m., no problem. But with all this space and all this room come a couple of responsibilities. So now you got to mow your own lawn. Right? You've got all these rooms, and you're going to have to clean them. You're going to have to furnish them. And then you also have to do like continuous maintenance work. So like every now and then, you're going to have to fix your roof. Right? When really all you wanted to do was enjoy this nice big house. If we bring it back to the world of app chains, there's a lot of overhead related to maintaining your own blockchain. So for one, you're going to need to incentivize validators. So you're either running validator nodes yourself or getting community members to do this. You're going to need to run nodes and infrastructure related to indexing and block explorers and RPC nodes and all this sort of stuff. If we go back to the idea of validators, you have to incentivize them to run nodes somehow. And that probably comes with issuing a token. And then that in itself is this big rabbit hole. Now you got to deal with the regulatory and legal hurdles of having a token, and even like the business relationships. And then having your own blockchain also comes with a bit of innovation slowdown. So, and it comes in two sort of ways. So if we think about what it takes to build kind of like an app chain in Polkadot, you have to do runtime development. And if any of you have done runtime development in the room, you know it can be a big hurdle to get stuff done and get stuff done quickly and efficiently. And even once you've done like all this hard work of runtime development, now you need to convince the community that your changes are worthwhile, and that might take a little bit of like politicking and negotiating and all this sort of stuff. And then it might take maybe 30 days or so for this change to actually be reflected on chain. So it's a whole big process that really slows down the innovation cycle. So this brings us to a couple tough questions about kind of the state of the ecosystem today. So for one, it's like, given that runtime development and running your own blockchain is kind of hard, it's like, are there any ways for us to kind of lower the barrier to entry to Polkadot and its parachains? From this, are there any ways that we can kind of foster and grow a community around our products, and specifically a developer community? And then from this, is there any way that we can bring more economic activity to our platforms? And you might say, oh, but everybody told me having my own lawn would be great, having my own blockchain would solve all my problems. And you might have spent a long time actually like talking to other ecosystems, other smart contract ecosystems, and telling them, oh yeah, we're living in the future. But really, we've seen that adoption hasn't been quite as good. That our innovation hasn't been quite as fast. So we do need to take a step back and kind of reconsider the app chain approach. And we need to do this kind of thinking about the end users and the end developers in mind. And we need to explore sort of different options. And maybe at the end of this whole exercise, we realize, OK, yeah, app chains, they were the future. Let's just go down this route. But if we don't take a step back and reassess, we'll never know. So the kind of like hypothesis that I'm working with is, can we use Inc smart contracts to bring more adoption and economic activity to parachains and Polkadot as a whole? So we'll be thinking about this throughout the rest of the presentation. And why should you even trust me on this? So for one, like on the Inc side, as one of the core developers, like I've been thinking a lot about the developer experience. Like how do we make this simple, safe for developers? We really want to make it easy to get people on board. And then also, as like a member of the Polkadot community, I've kind of seen the first cohort of parachains come through. Like I've seen the struggles that they've gone through to kind of like get their apps into production. And it's very much a non-trivial journey today. All right, so now let's go and revisit smart contracts. We can start by talking about some of the advantages of smart contracts. So for one, the developer experience is way simpler. Beyond the fact that we've engineered Inc to be like quite easy to get into, there's also just a lot less stuff you need to think about. You're like living in the sandbox environment. There's a lot less for you to kind of mess up in case things go wrong. Smart contracts also have a nice property in that they're permissionless to deploy. So I can go and deploy 1,000 contracts on a smart contract platform today. Whereas if I wanted to spin up, let's say, 10 or 100 parachains, even like especially on Polkadot, I need a lot of capital. I got to acquire a slot. I got to run all this infrastructure. Like it's a lot of work to scale up. And this kind of ties into this next point, where once I've deployed a smart contract, for the most part, it's hands-off, right? It's kind of living on chain. You don't need to worry about whether or not it's going to exist in 6 months. Whereas with an app chain, like you're going to need to keep some of this infrastructure running, or at the very least, convince community members and incentivize them to keep all this infrastructure running. So it doesn't scale quite as well. And then smart contracts also have a cool property of synchronous composability. So what this means is that you can fit a lot of transactions in a single block and have them execute back to back to back to back. So this is really evident in kind of the world of DeFi, where you can have like, take out a loan in one transaction, do a swap on the next transaction, do a swap after that, and all this is kind of one atomic unit. So they all kind of work together. And what this means is that you can pack a lot more work in a lot less units of time. And then you might come back and say, oh, OK, but our ecosystem has kind of moved on, and it's focused on runtime development. It's focused on app chains. And this is kind of true. There are a lot of tutorials. There's a lot more code out there that's battle tested. There's just a lot more resources and a lot more developer mindshare for running your app chain. But this is changing. We've gotten our first couple production deployments of Inc on Polkadot in the last few months. We've gotten SR Labs and OpenZeppelin to kind of take a peek at our code base recently. So the community is growing, and as time goes on, it's going to become much more battle-hardened and trusted. And then we also have this idea around marketing, right? Like, we've already told everybody that the app chain future is the future, and we're going to need to like do a lot of work to change that narrative, and that's part of what I'm doing here. So what do we do, in this case, right? There's benefits to smart contracts. There's clearly benefits to app chains. So why don't we bring them together? And this is what we're calling, hybrid chains or hybrid contracts. It just depends on what aspect you look at it from. And the idea is that we take the best bits of smart contracts and the best bits of app chains and kind of bundle them together. And what this looks like more concretely is an app chain that has like a little bit of a layer of smart contracts on top. It's not totally flexible. It's not a total smart contract platform, but it's also not a total app chain platform. So you get kind of like, you get like a thin layer of innovation on top. Let's dig into that a little deeper. So I talked about synchronous composability from smart contracts and asynchronous composability from app chains. If we combine these two, we can kind of improve the economic kind of density of our applications. So you can have applications that do really fast sort of compute, like these DeFi applications taking loans and swaps and all sorts of different things in one block. But you can still reach out to other ecosystems and do all sorts of like crazy stuff that your app chain doesn't have natively. So you can kind of get the best of both worlds there. The other benefit is that you can kind of use this hybrid chain model as an engine for innovation. And you can do this in two ways. So one is from a parachain team's point of view. So you can have the stable core that is your parachain, but then kind of do permissionless deployments of smart contracts and test new features, develop new features against that stable core. And you can do this much more quickly. You don't need to go through the whole runtime upgrade process. And you can even test and develop some of this stuff on mainnet. So it's a lot lower barrier to entry for you to innovate. The other side we can take is that from third-party developers. So as a parachain team, you've kind of exposed this cool sort of primitive, this core functionality. And now you can have a community of third-party developers building like innovative projects on top. And then it is those developers that are going to end up getting users and building cool use cases for users. So you've, in effect, been able to grow this community in a way that you wouldn't have been able to do if you just stayed a closed platform. So thinking back to our city analogy, so if the app chain model was a big country house, this hybrid chain model is like a flat in the city, where you've got all sorts of different businesses that are close by and easily accessible, and they kind of all work with each other. So you might, for example, have a restaurant and a theater that are beside each other. And before the show, people are going to go to the restaurant. So that brings economic kind of activity to both of them. You might have a cafe and a grocery store nearby. And maybe the cafe runs out of milk, so they can just run across the street, grab some milk, problem solved. And then if anything isn't kind of in that immediate neighborhood, you can always reach out to a different neighborhood, maybe take your bike. It's going to take a little bit longer for you to get what you need, but you will eventually do it. So we can kind of have the best of both worlds here. That said, the city life does come with some complexity. So if you're a parachain team, you might now need to manage both a runtime stack and a smart contract stack. If you're using Ink, though, at least they're both using Rust. So it's not going to be that much harder for you to kind of like work across both boundaries, but it is added complexity. If you're a parachain team, you're also going to need to expose your core functionality in some way. And that's going to add more code, which again adds more complexity. You're now also going to have to go back to sharing resources a little bit. All your compute isn't just dedicated for your application anymore. You're going to put a little bit towards these smart contracts. And same with storage. These smart contracts might create a ton of storage on your chain. So how do you mitigate this? On the compute side, you can limit kind of like how much block weight is consumed by smart contracts versus your app chain. So you can mitigate it that way. And then on the storage side, the contracts pad actually has a cool feature where anytime storage is kind of like created, it takes a storage deposit from users. So you can't just like infinitely grow the state for free, as you see in some other smart contract platforms. And then there's also the question of tooling. So if I were to call a smart contract from another smart contract and trigger an XCM, and then trigger smart contract execution on another chain, what does this look like from like a block explorer's point of view? I've got no clue. It's not built out today. And that's where we need to come together as a community and think about these kind of future use cases. And if we do it, it'll be worth it. We'll really be able to get some benefits from building a community. We'll be able to kind of like drive innovation, build quicker, build faster, and really engage more end users. And it's kind of like being at a party with all your friends, right? You've like all come together, built this thing, and now you can go and enjoy yourselves, after all the hard work. And what does this look like in practice? And in practice, it's not too hard. For the most part, it's just like throwing this into your runtime. There is a little bit more complexity, but really, you can get started in doing this today. And then the next step for you would be to kind of like, as a parachain team, either learn about Ink yourselves or teach your community members about it. And we've got a lot of good documentation on use.ink. But really, it's that education aspect that's going to help drive growth and foster innovation. And there's a couple parachain teams already committing to the hybrid life. So I want to highlight them. So this is a pull request from the Zeitgeist repo. It was merged a couple days ago, I think, or maybe last week. For those of you that don't know, Zeitgeist is a prediction market platform on Polkadot. And they've added smart contracts. And what this allows them to do is kind of expose this prediction market idea as a core primitive. And then now you can have all sorts of programmable logic on top. Maybe you have a smart contract that automatically does some action based off the kind of resolution of a market, or triggers new markets based off resolutions of other markets. But again, this is going to be up to third-party developers to kind of innovate on and use this primitive in new, cool ways. So there's another team that kind of like committed to using Rust smart contracts recently as well, and it's Interlay. So Interlay is kind of the Bitcoin bridge into the Polkadot ecosystem. And you can imagine there's a lot of utility being able to do programmable actions around this primitive that is Bitcoin. And you can do stuff that you can't do on the canonical Bitcoin blockchain, right? Like all sorts of atomic swaps or cool like DeFi applications. And there's only going to be like more and more innovation, because this primitive was exposed to third-party developers. All right, so let's wrap this up. So what did we go over today? So we saw that, given our current app chain kind of like thesis, we're not driving enough users, we're not driving enough innovation to our platform. So we need to take a step back and kind of rethink our approach. And we figured that combining Ink smart contracts with app chains and runtime development would give us nice properties, and we'd be able to drive more users and more economic activity to our platforms. And the next steps for you as builders is to go integrate pallet contracts, integrate Ink, and really teach your community about this stuff, and embrace the serendipity that comes from adding third-party developers to your platforms. If you want to learn more, we've got a lot of good docs and a lot of good tutorials on use.ink. You can also reach out to us on Twitter. Inklang, we're pretty active there. I also do want to give a shout out to Dima, our designer, for making all these cool slides. Just total beautiful work. I'll be around if anybody has any questions after. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your Decoded.